my theory was, as we move into the informational era, it's not monetary currencies that solve a lot of our problems. It's reputational currencies and formalized social fabric that start answering these problems that we're confronted with.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guest is Sid Sthalekar. Sid is the founder of Neighbourhoods, an open source infrastructure designed to enable new social coordination patterns for the world. In this conversation, Sid shares how he grew up in India and was sold the dream of capitalism and neoliberal free markets, but then became less convinced over time about these approaches. He then went to the ashram and studied Gandhian Economics, where he was introduced to the idea of reputational currencies. Sid makes the point that we usually think about monetary currencies, but the reputation layer is actually where a lot of social issues can be addressed. And the solution space is being transformed by the advent of blockchains. Sid is integrating these ideas into Neighbourhoods using a distributed tech approach. We discuss example use cases like mutual credit, valuing caregiving and elders, and creating space for more intimate social interactions than our current monetary system can handle. I ask Sid, how do we ensure this doesn't become like a Black Mirror episode where social interactions are even more hyper-financialized? And we discuss some of the potential negative and shadow aspects. We also talk about blockchain architecture and why Sid is building with Holochain. And lastly, we discuss Sid's recent move to New Zealand, which he calls surprisingly wholesome, and how the innovation space is uniquely positioned here. I hope you enjoy this discussion with Sid Sthalekar. Welcome, Sid.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
So what is Neighbourhoods?
Neighbourhoods is a project that's enabling social coordination at scale, allowing communities to articulate and formalize cultural norms that are important to them, use these formalized norms to coordinate themselves better, govern themselves better, and also coordinate across allied groups and communities, and in doing so enable new ways of responding to large complex issues. It's probably the shortest way to explain it, and we can unpack that.
In 5-10 years, practically speaking, how does it affect my life? Like what will be the use cases potential here?
I think the use cases vary dramatically, from playful socio-cultural use cases like sharing memes with a group of people that share your sense of humor or aesthetic, to livelihood generation and economic empowerment, commercial use cases like supply chains organized in new ways, commerce activated in new ways. And so it's as broad spectrum as you can imagine, because I would say we're building economic infrastructure to unlock new expressive capacities that are currently not amplified in people and communities. And so think of this as a formalization tool that communities can now leverage. And so we can get into that.
Well,
that's the high level.
We'd love to hear how did you come into this work? What were some of the motivations and experiences that informed this?
I would say different, like core members of Neighbourhoods have their own trajectories into this, and we can get into that. But personally, a lot of this has to do with the way economics, culture, and technology interact and play with each other. I grew up in Mumbai at a very critical period, largely communal life, communitarian ways of life were giving way to this wave of neoliberalism sweeping into across the world and into India as well. When I was 11, I witnessed communal riots in the city of Mumbai. And so this doesn't come from a romanticization of communitarian approaches. In fact, I feel like there's some kind of understanding of some of the tribal nature that humans have. My formative years, like the 90s, were part of embracing this new neoliberal wave. Like overnight, we were given access to multiple channels and Michael Jordan shooting across my screen and Levi's ads flooding into our living room. And it was an interesting dynamic because it was almost like this trade-off being presented to us. I grew up speaking 4 or 5 different languages. That's just the way Indian life is organized. But there was this one global identity being presented as embrace this and, you can participate in this wave that's sweeping across the world. And I was all in, like as a young kid, let's do it. Went to business school, then joined a trading floor, and there was this conversation about, emerging markets sweeping across the world, how capitalism could solve some pretty deep-rooted problems in parts of the world like South Asia. And I was very intrigued by it, enthused by it. And so, yeah, sitting on a trading floor that literally was, expanding. I was in equity derivatives and algorithmic trading. It was like a front row seat at, how all of these complex issues were being solved by capitalism. And of course, the 2008 crisis happened. Lehman Brothers was one of my biggest clients. But at the same time, stepping out of your fancy office in Mumbai, you are confronted by how much the trickle-down thing isn't happening, right? Like you might be in a fancy car, but you're still literally looking at a child that doesn't have food that day. And so it sparked off a bunch of thinking for me. And I didn't really have answers. And so I decided to spend about 4 to 5 years in the Gandhi ashram in India. It was a community formed around the independence struggle in India in the 1930s. And at the time, it was an interesting community where a lot of socio-cultural experimentation was occurring for the region at large. And that's where I kind of got exposed to Gandhian economics or distributed economics, how communities and groups of people can coordinate with each other without an overarching structure by formalizing social norms and interacting with each other. And I was at that time kind of upset that I hadn't been exposed to this stream of economics in business school. And so fully, noted out, had the opportunity to understand how indigenous, rural, and urban communities in India were operating with some of these principles.
How would you define, sorry to interrupt you, how would you define Gandhian economics?
There's an interesting book called The Economy of Permanence, for anyone who's listening, written by a Gandhian economist called J.C. Kumarappa. But a lot of, I would say, some of the deeper principles of nonviolence form the basis for these theories. For me, it was fascinating because I'd just been through the cycle of how neoliberal economics that had swept across the world, in a way, had this neo-colonial vibe to it because it was imposing a certain generic global culture on communities that had to participate. And I could see how Gandhian economics had a theory as to how people could coordinate with each other without letting go of their root cultural identity. And benefiting economically or solving large global problems at scale didn't mean you have to speak a certain way or adopt a certain culture. And that was fascinating to me. And so I found Gandhian economics intersecting with what a new era we were shifting into, which almost like this post-industrial informational era where social fabric, formalized reputation, intersects well with informational era in a way industrial economics doesn't. Like you could say information or ideas are non-zero sum, as we see with the internet. Like an idea can ripple across the world in seconds and grip it. Whereas the old economics of stuff, like if I have, 3 pencils and I give you one, I now have 2 left. But if I have an idea and I share it with you, I don't lose it. You could see how Gandhian economics, which wasn't very successful in the 1930s and 40s because ultimately industrial economics took root. You could see how there was this little portal now because of technologies like Holochain, like distributed ledger technology, peer-to-peer technology, where these principles of formalized social fabric, reputation economics, etc., could now start taking root at scale. And my theory was, as we move into the informational era, it's not monetary currencies that solve a lot of our problems. It's reputational currencies and formalized social fabric that start answering these problems that we're entering in, that we're confronted with. And I can break that down if you like, but
can you say more about that distinction, monetary problems versus reputational?
Sure. I think it comes down to this notion of, I think we all understand monetary currencies. Like, let's say I have 5 gold coins, I give you 4, I now have 1 left. And that forms the basis, I think, of the Industrial Revolution. We formalized monetary currencies. So if I have money in a bank account in Singapore, I show up in New Zealand, my money ports over in seconds. We haven't formalized a system for social fabric. It still kind of works in an informal way where someone we know in common will kind of vouch and say, Sid, meet Matthew, like you guys should talk. And so when I port myself from Singapore to New Zealand, my monetary currency is ported over in seconds. My social fabric is still old school. And so this notion of reputation currencies was interesting to me because distributed ledger tech allows a community to articulate it formally and also port it as they move from one community to another. So what's interesting about reputation currency is if I contribute to my community garden in Christchurch and I decide to visit Wellington, my contributions can actually be validated as someone who's important to the community, someone who's highly regarded by the community. And so when I'm contributing, if these are allied communities I'm part of across the world, when I contribute to a community in Christchurch, simultaneously I'm being validated by hundreds of communities around the world. And so you start seeing how reputation currencies vibe really well with information networks. There's a non-zero sumness that they share.
Right.
And so what if ideas didn't have to ride on the old industrial era economics anymore, but could actually ride on this new economic system of reputation currencies? I think there's a deeper alignment there that this 21st century that we're entering into deserves. It's almost like we've entered the 21st century, but we're still living in a house with 18th century plumbing. And that tends to distort the way we live. It almost holds back expressive capacities. But if we update the plumbing, we could be unlocking more value for everyone. And so the objective isn't to do away with monetary currencies, but create like a multidimensional system where reputation currencies and monetary currencies play with each other. And so you could have systems where if I'm a highly regarded member of my community in Christchurch, I might have a credit limit in my local community, which actually provides me a sense of security and livelihood. But if I move to Wellington, can my social fabric actually be regarded in Wellington, in Singapore, in Mumbai? And can I actually enjoy credit limits in these groups as well? That would be fascinating because it doesn't keep contributions to communities locked in the silos that they tended to be, but actually create these mimetic mesh networks where contributions can ripple across the world in a different way, not in the same way that, let's say, the global economic system does, but in more contextual ways. And that notion has always gripped me over the years. And it feels like where it's enabling a new kind of coordination that's not so rooted in enforcement, but in mediation. And that, I think, is the crux of Gandhian economics, where you don't need violence to enforce certain ways of doing things. It could be non-violent and more contextual. And
is
so
credit the primary mechanism in which those types of reputational values flow, where now I have access to maybe a more fluid and flexible way of purchasing things and acquiring, services, because it's more predicated on my reputational relational fabric? Or are there other
ways in which they intersect?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Like, I think, how do these axes start intersecting with each other? And again, I think this is just me riffing, you and I riffing. I think as communities start playing with this, we're going to see infinite modes of expression of this. Credit, obviously, the first one that comes to mind, but in spaces where aesthetic or importance of quality is valued, I think it could start showing up. So a designer or filmmaker who's highly regarded by one community and it is another community that shares that same aesthetic would immediately welcome such an individual and also be willing to offer them a higher monetary compensation.
Right.
If that's what they choose to do it. You could have other interesting expressions emerge as well. I think it's really unlimited in terms of how this could go. For example, in spaces that need intimacy, especially like caregivers spaces, you want to be able. Not everyone can be a good babysitter. Not everyone can be a good caregiver. But you would regard Matthew's community's sense of this person is a deeply trusted individual, a deeply trusted caregiver, and therefore I would be willing to let them in my most deepest intimate spaces. And that's something the monetary economy or the internet as an expression of that monetary economy can't handle. Like you try doing something over Facebook Marketplace and it's I can sell a lamp, but would I let that person into my home? Probably not. And so I think in a way this starts regarding caregivers' work in new ways, or starts encouraging intimate activities in a way just the internet just couldn't deliver. Recognition of elders in communities. And so in one of our pilot projects or projects where we're exploring things with, they would like to value elders in their regenerative agriculture community that are storing a broad diversity of seeds. There's not an immediate monetary reward to that, but they're thinking of interesting designs where such elders or individuals gain greater visibility in the ecosystem. And so where agrotourism would benefit them the most, because when outsiders visit the ecosystem, they would see these elders as someone they would like to spend time with and stay with. And so that's an example of how monetary rewards could flow to elders of a community. And so it creates, I would say, much more contextual and beautiful pathways into which reward could reach or sustenance could reach these individuals, rather than you're the elder or you're the caregiver, let's just increase your wages, because that's just operating on one dimension. And so instead we're just saying let's try and have as many loops and dimensions as possible.
Well, what I hear from you is kind of an exploration of bringing value to places where the monetary system doesn't currently recognize, but where value exists, or where, reputation, prestige, respect, care, and so it's like, in many ways, it feels like this kind of exploration of the evolution and the expansion of how we think about money. And when I hear like these kinds of efforts to create, it sounds a lot like social credit score.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like Black Mirror episodes where every, kind of now social interaction is being
tracked.
Tracked, but quantified. Like there's this shadow of this, which is like that all of a sudden everything now becomes its own means to an end, or like the Goodhart's law, we start optimizing for all these behaviors because it's going to increase our social credit score. And how do you think about that other side of the balance?
Yeah, it's interesting. The team, like the Neighbourhoods team, like made a conscious decision to not actively speak about reputation currencies because we found we were fighting the wrong battles. Like every conversation I've had about reputation currencies is referenced Black Mirror. I think there's season 3, episode 9. I think it's called Nosedive, where everyone's rating each other. We've had conversations with people in China about the social credit score system. And the clunky monolithic ways in which they're done. I think obviously at worst they're dystopian. At best, I think they're ineffective. Because some of these monolithic credit systems that are being designed don't really render any benefits. Like communities don't tend to engage with it as much. So you'll get a library book for free if you're a good citizen. Is that really, I don't know, is that really a reward? In any case, I should definitely add disclaimers to this. One, I don't think all interactions, all communities need to be formalized. I think there's tremendous value in groups that choose to hold culture informally. And I'm part of multiple groups in this way. I think formalization is a conscious decision taken by a group for specific reasons. Like they might want to operate at a certain scale of, 50,000 individuals for certain kinds of activities, and coordinating themselves better is important. Governance is another one where we've all been part of communities, have all experienced this heartbreak of like, well, you said this thing, but now you're doing something else, and I've given my life to this. And so I think it'll nudge communities to be more transparent about what they're saying, but what the actual cultural norms might be. I also think groups operating at a small scale, like let's say it's 12 individuals in some part of the world, might choose to formalize activities, formalize their culture, or what they're doing within their group purely for the benefit of coordinating better with allied communities. And so let's say with 12 people in the middle of nowhere, maintaining a little community garden, but our community is highly regarded or well regarded by dozens or hundreds of others of groups around the world. It allows our groups to benefit from the network effects of our contributions, the zero-sum nature of our contributions. And so I think in many cases what we're talking about is simple recording of contributions. We're not talking about, are you a good person or a good date? Like I think that's some of the clunky ways in which people would use this. I actually think some of that is ineffective. And I think even if done badly is localized. And so a lot of what we're speaking about are social primitives. Like I said, like storing a broad range of seeds, contributing to a community garden, writing an insightful, thoughtful blog, lending money to someone, returning the money lent to you, sharing resources. Like I have limes in my backyard, and you might choose to offer them for free to your community. You might choose to offer them at a discounted price to your community. And again, it's up to the community to decide what's valuable to them. Like I said, it's up to the community to decide if this formalization is important to them. I don't imagine a lot of the communities we exist in today fit in that category, because I think so much beauty and complexity is held in those informal relationships. I think this formalized notion of a community is probably a new class of organizing that's about to be unleashed. And any assessments made by the community of you've contributed to the garden is and you've done a good job of it, is held locally for local benefits. And so we're seeing interesting examples where a community may contribute to the garden locally, but also decides that these individuals who contribute have a 10x vote on their decisions around the climate.
Mm.
So it's almost like this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're connected to the land, you understand climate better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of formalization or recording of information that we're speaking about. Because there's very little sense in making judgments like you're a great individual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that won't really be the kinds of use cases that we're speaking about. And again, like most of that is held locally. So what might be punctual in India is definitely not punctual in Singapore. And that's been my personal experience. And so we're not talking about very clunky monolithic assessments of people in any case.
Yeah, the formalization, I really agree. Like we are at the cusp of this phenomenon. I like this word that you're giving it, formalization. It's making so many things explicit through this information technology that might have been implicit or not, labeled. But the context in which it happens matters so much. So what I hear you saying is like it's a localized context. This isn't, if you put it in a context of an authoritarian, opaque, undemocratic context, that's one context. If you put it in a context where it's self-governed and within a community and around use cases that are trying to bring value to something that has intrinsic value but is not being nourished and resourced and recognized, that's a different context.
Yeah. Something worth talking about there is the friction between communities, culture, and technology. And our experience with technology over the last 20 years has been full of friction and almost being held ransom to technology.
Totally.
To the extent that it's caused a lot of scarring. So most communities we speak to are just like almost offended by the thought of including technology into communities. And so a lot of work over the last few years has been ensuring technology interfaces with community in the way that it is in service to the culture of the group. For example, we're sitting here in this arrangement. The chairs have been arranged in this beautiful way, and the light isn't, arranged in this beautiful way. It's people here have chosen to make that arrangement in service to our conversation. But technology's evolved in this weird way where someone in San Francisco's decided this is the way everyone should sit, and they're making these very deep cultural decisions that are enforced onto groups.
Yep.
And so people don't think about how much this decision to use a like button or to order a feed in a certain way or to restrict certain kinds of conversations, or, you can't have threaded conversations here. You can have only visual conversations here. And if you'd like to speak in this way, go to the other platform. It's holding the group at ransom. And so a big part of our journey has been embracing peer-to-peer technologies, but in particular technologies like Holochain, which allow us to create very lightweight, modular bundles of code that can be slotted in and plugged into community. Like you chose to buy these 2 chairs. They didn't come packaged with the house. And again, I think that's because industrial era economics has been applied to technology, which keeps, which has caused it to be designed in this way. And so it's absurd that, modular technology is novel. Like it shouldn't be. And so it's creating an interesting model where when a group decides to formalize and create a space of their own, let's call that a neighborhood, they can slot in these generic modules and they have complete control over what that space looks like, what assessments they can layer into it, what they choose as resources for their information, for their coordination. So a group might choose time contribution is important, articles published are important, payments made are important, what assessments and therefore what emojis they might like. And you might see some creative innovation there where groups evolve new kinds of emojis or vibe checks for their group. New governance modules are templates that they can fully customize. And so I think I see a lot of value in revitalizing and healing this relationship we've had with technology, where it should be in service to us. And so a big part of Neighborhoods has been restoring that dynamic. And therefore, when someone chooses to formalize, we call them community activators, almost like entrepreneurs in this space, like cultural entrepreneurs. Don't need to have dev experience, don't need to have fundraising experience. It's almost like throwing a little dinner party and being very specific about the shape of the room and who you'd like to invite and what kind of conversations get amplified more. And there shouldn't be friction in that process. And that's that's been very critical to our work. And I would say some of the other members within the team hold this very dearly, in terms of the power dynamics between communities and technology need to be restored. Yeah.
You've referenced Holochain a couple times. Can you share more about what is Holochain and your journey with it?
Yeah, it's been a long and eventful journey. And I think that's just the nature of distributed tech, because it is allowing us to create or to work with. It's almost like requires a decolonization of sorts, because it's not the classical cloud architecture where you've got one space where everything's been coordinated very efficiently, and obviously the markets love that because it's efficient. But in distributed architectures, you're creating new patterns where information is held in a scattered way across the group. And so what's really beautiful or important about technologies like Holochain is that it allows a group to maintain, record, and validate information in an extremely low-cost way, in a non-tamperable form. So if I've made contributions to my community garden, the group holds it in a non-tamperable way where my contributions can't be refuted. And that obviously was one of the breakthroughs of blockchain technology. But I would say technologies like Holochain are post-blockchain, where my contributions to the community garden don't need to be stored in this universal blockchain with millions of computers, because the cost is really high for such recording. But Holochain allowed those costs to drop down significantly because they're held by a community. And that's really important because the likes I received on my blog or my timestamps for my contribution in the garden may not have a monetary footprint right away. Like we talked about, those intersections can be varied and happen over time. And so if we're going to spend 50 cents or $7 like you do on the Ethereum blockchain today, you're not going to store contextually relevant information. You only store monetarily critical information, and which is why we see, blockchains are great for cryptocurrencies. But am I going to record my community contributions? Probably not. And which is why you need technologies like Holochain to record formal social fabric, because it's stored on my chain and in fragments across the community. And what's interesting is it's agent-centric. So as I hop from one neighborhood to another, I actually get to port my context with me. And so it creates an interesting dynamic where, like, if I show up at your dinner party, it's quite likely I'll bump into someone I know from the gym or another community where we have shared interests with. There's not a centralized algo that you run at your dinner party to curate my experience, which is what we do with platforms today. Like when I show up on Instagram, it's like, let us curate an experience for you,
right? Because
I'm a blank slate. So this allows me to move from one neighborhood to another with my context with me. And so I actually think, again, it's this interesting conversation where we're activating distributed webs of social intelligence, as opposed to an over-reliance on centralized AI for curating every experience was. Like as I go through my life, there's not an algo in the sky which is telling me like, go to this coffee shop, Sid, and meet Matthew, Sid. It's these little activated agent-centric networks, which is like, Emily, meet Matt. Emily says, meet Matthew, and that's how we work. And there's I would say they're much more high bandwidth and relevant loops of information for us. And so I would say technologies like Holochain and projects like Neighbourhoods are about activating those networks and reducing our reliance on an algo in the sky that curates our experience. And I would say like these kinds of networks are way more resilient, and I would say also hit the spot in terms of what we're really looking for, which is deep connection and much more relevant customization for our experiences. So I would say that's how technologies like Holochain have allowed us to drop the cost for communities to store non-tamperable information and broaden the spectrum of what they're storing. It's not just monetarily critical; it's contextually relevant stuff, which forms the basis for, I would say, much more wholesome coordination.
Do you think the blockchain space is increasingly moving into this type of more modular and distributed architecture with things happening in Cosmos, things happening with layer twos? Do you think this is kind of the natural evolution of the space as a whole? Or do you think that there's going to be this kind of market difference between an architecture like Holochain and the architectures of some of the other smart contract platforms?
That's an interesting question. I think layer twos have dropped costs dramatically for blockchains and present new solutions that, I think are valuable. But they're still holding on to this notion of access to a universal highway. And so stuff still has to be coordinated across a universal blockchain in some way. Whereas post-blockchain technologies like Holochain kind of cut that cord and say, no, actually it's the agents who create those mimetic bridges between groups. And I think there's a lot of value in that because, even though I'm not using 10 cents to store or cents to store record conversations on a layer 2, in an environment like Holochain, it's free, potentially. And I think that playfulness that it unleashes is remarkably more useful for community coordination. And at some level, I'm just like, why would you not cut the cord? Like I understand that, universal blockchains are important and let's use those. But I feel like Holochain, there's probably room for 50 more to evolve. And I think that's probably what we're sitting on the cusp of over the next few years. And we're kind of excited about that because Neighbourhoods would be very keen to play across that entire spectrum and be present or have manifestations in across all these distributed contextual ways of storing information. So you're right in the sense like there's something really exciting about to happen there. And I think the world is large enough to accommodate for all these expressions. And why not? Yeah.
Okay, so you went from the trading desk to the ashram, found Holochain, built Neighbourhoods. You've also just recently moved to New Zealand. Tell me about that.
A lot of this was personal. My wife's from here. She left New Zealand 20 years ago in the interest of an international career. We had kids during COVID, experienced lockdown in Singapore, felt the need for connecting with family, and that's where New Zealand came out very strongly for us. I think in that sense, it's been great to raise a couple of young kids in the South Island, have access to family. But there was definitely a larger conversation of this tension between being global nomads and citizens of everywhere, but at the same time, you're really a citizen of nowhere, and you could see the way the world is turning. And while my wife and I have been quite rooted in our own cultural identities, we could see how some of that would play out with our kids, and the need for them and for us to be rooted and integrated somewhere. And I did ask myself some honest questions, like, if we're talking about a project like Neighborhoods, are we ourselves rooted in some context, or are we going to exist in this in the ether somewhere and nowhere at the same time? And so the decision, while also personal, was also interesting for Neighborhoods to find itself contextualizing itself and integrating within the fabric of New Zealand. And that's been a beautiful process, I think, enabled for me through the Edmund Hillary Fellowship that people such as yourself have been critical in shaping. It has been almost like a landing strip for us here. But while engaging with the infrastructure here, it's been beautiful to see, as a Western country, extremely clear, stable frameworks to work with. But at the same time, as a small nation in the middle of nowhere, relatively, it's not had lobbyists erode away protections for the rights of small companies and individuals. And so it's allowing us, Neighborhoods, as a community-funded, owned, and governed project, to emerge without some of the friction that you see, and that's been emerged over the last 20 years, just out of incumbents making it harder for competition to thrive. And so, there's this joke, like, most Kiwi entrepreneurs I come across dream of moving to Singapore when they hit certain scale, and they're just shocked about why we're making this decision to move into New Zealand. But I would actually urge most entrepreneurs who might be listening to this, I think it's a great place to be headquartered, to operate out of, if you're looking to move towards a community-owned structure. And that was really important for us, because it would be odd for Neighborhoods to be funded by VCs. And so in that sense, I think Neighborhoods as New Zealand has been a great experience as like the roots of this project, or the grounding for this project, or the tether for this project. I think tether is a better word.
Can you talk through those mechanics of how you're organizing the capital stack and doing things differently, and the roadmap there, and then how that fits within the New Zealand regulatory landscape?
We spoke earlier about some of the origins and the academic journey of Neighborhoods. And so over the years, we've always been in the habit of presenting our vision. And I think a lot of people have found it weird and bold and abstract, all at the same time. But I think we must have, over the years, done hundreds of gatherings, over 10,000 people in living rooms, co-working spaces around the world. And along the way, people have stepped forward wanting to fund us. And we're really, really grateful to some of these people. And so through that process, used a crypto token as an instrument towards this community-owned structure. And that's allowed us to get this far, allowed us to build the open source scaffolding that forms the basis of the Neighborhoods stack, the Neighborhoods framework, as we call it. We're now at that stage where this framework has stabilized, and we're inviting communities in to pilot with us. And so this next phase, we feel more comfortable about giving guidance towards traction with users, what kind of revenues and profitability we're about to generate. And so it felt appropriate for us to move to this phase where these funders, or people who have backed us along the way, can also formally participate in our governance and even access reserves that we're generating. And just watching the way things have evolved in the financial space over the last couple of years, it felt appropriate. Like, it almost made sense to do this through the traditional equity route. And again, in New Zealand, to be a broadly owned, community owned project is still shockingly easy. And so there's exchanges for this, there's good frameworks and laws for this. And so we're in that transition process where a lot of our backers will have that option to actually come in and formally govern us. All of this is being steered by a charitable trust called the Neighbourhoods Foundation that steers the work of the Neighbourhoods framework and has now incorporated a marketplace that will sell these generic modules that will allow communities to access generic modules. And this marketplace called the Bazaar would list on an exchange here in New Zealand, which would allow people to participate and formally play a role in our governance. And so it's been quite the trajectory, but I feel like that's part of working through these volatile times, trying to be as honest and upfront about this with people. But yeah, it's kind of exciting to be able to activate this. Again, it's like kind of counterintuitive in the crypto industry. Like, what do you want to give more rights to your investors when you can get away with, just a utility token? But we feel like it actually is important because formal feedback, backed by regulations would actually help us in the longer run. And we can see value in that, like not just our communities participating, but even individuals around the world starting to give feedback in a way which is much more real and not just a few team members' opinions on how this project should be evolving.
So if I understand it correctly, Neighbourhoods Foundation, you said, is kind of the steward, and then you have the marketplace, the Bazaar, which is a company, and you have this Neighbourhoods token, and so the token already exists, and you're essentially going through this phase shift of the token having more governance responsibilities, possibly claims to treasury reserves, cash flow, etc. So basically going from a token to a tokenized security or a security itself.
I think the best way to frame it is token holders would have the option.
So token holders have the option to become security holders.
Yeah, exactly.
And those securities are going to be New Zealand registered securities?
Yep. Just shares, boring old shares in a company. And we might create a tokenized version of that. But I feel like it's an interesting dynamic playing out in this space where you've had this divergence, Bitcoin maxis, etc. And now it feels like we're entering into an era of convergence and integration. And I think I see regulations starting to evolve around the world where, the United States, the UK, New Zealand form this little mesh where projects that are still young can stay community owned, be answerable to their backers for a relatively low cost. It's starting to emerge, and we're wanting to leverage some of that as that trend.
And who are those exchanges that are enabling that?
Yeah. So in New Zealand, an exchange called Catalyst, which allows young companies to IPO for a fairly moderate to low cost, but still sort of ensures the transparency towards its investors.
And you're saying it's kind of like a 5-figure rather than 6-figure cost to do that?
Yeah. It's shockingly low, having come, from places like Singapore, where these figures can be remarkably high. So for any project around the world or in New Zealand that's looking to leverage some of these platforms, I would really recommend it. It's been an absolute delight working with them so far and exploring this pathway with them, because they value projects like Neighbourhoods. It's not the classical how many users and what are you going to be a unicorn in X years. They see the value in things like the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. They see the value in the larger social impact that we might be creating. and have been extremely patient and understanding towards projects like ours. And so in that sense, I feel very validated and see how the system still works. And so I've developed a lot of faith in what that might enable over the next few years.
So practically speaking, once this process is done, I or anyone in New Zealand could purchase securities, shares of Neighbourhood,
absolutely,
off of Catalyst.
Yeah.
Is there a minimum threshold of, like there is in the States, around accredited investor qualifications?
So New Zealand has this notion of eligible investors, and I'm just going to paraphrase some of those regulations. So I'd really recommend people go read it up. But I feel like it's very well framed, because eligible investors are investors who consider themselves to be sophisticated. And there's a little, base levels of certification for that, but it's one of the few frameworks that I haven't found offensive, because in many other jurisdictions, it's like, well, if you have $3 million, you are sophisticated.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely very little research to show that that's true. Like there's a lot of rich people or like institutions that have made some pretty silly decisions. And I see, and I can see why, those kinds of crude judgments emerge. But I feel like New Zealand's taken the pains to not fall into those categories. And in particular with exchanges like Catalyst, it's also opens participation to the average individual. And again, credit to the FMA here, credit to the founders of Catalyst for really holding that sacred. And I can see how regulators around the world would much rather not have to deal with things blowing up and chaos. But I feel like in the New Zealand context, there's still value to individual participation and their ability to generate wealth by backing projects that are meaningful to them. And so, I would say it's one of the few regulations I find non-offensive.
Any other observations or reflections on doing business in New Zealand or interfacing with regulators?
In terms of doing business, I'm as an entrepreneur, I am shocked that they still trust entrepreneurs. most other jurisdictions, I mean, I don't blame them. Over the last 20 years, like entrepreneurs have done some pretty nasty things. And so there is just that culture of like, we don't trust you. But in New Zealand, it's just weird how trusted I feel. And you can see it in the language. You can also see it in the reactions when you meet them. And I've been meeting in Wellington, spent the last few days meeting a few people, even reaching out over LinkedIn, and the responses you receive. People are interested in what you do, not for, and very much for the, very wholesome reasons of like, they just want to see good things happen.
You mean the regulators?
Yeah. It's, I think some seasoned Kiwi entrepreneurs might call me naive, and maybe I am. Like, it's still early days for that. But I feel like my objectives are different, or maybe my expectations are different. Like, I'm not talking necessarily about like airdropping of grants, but I'm just saying allowing new innovations to emerge. Like, that's all my ask is. And I feel very validated in that regard. And again, I credit the Edmund Hillary Fellowship for maintaining, I would say, like opening up those relational networks. I think New Zealand is relational. And so there is that, oh, your wife's from here and you live here, like you're now in a different category because you're not, passing through or like trying to use New Zealand as just another jurisdiction. So I think there's that different experience for me. But again, I think in that sense, for us to be headquartered here has been surprisingly, and we've eased into it over the last year or year and a half, and it's been surprisingly wholesome. Yeah,
I noticed that distinction of once New Zealand's your home, once you've moved here, there is a different level of trust and like collaboration afforded.
Mm.
And I don't know. I think it's almost just because like we're in the middle of the ocean, the bottom of the world, and so it's like, okay, now we're in it together.
Yeah. Or you've committed to this.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them. And coming from India, I find relational networks, like I derive warmth from them. I actually respect it because you're not willing to open yourself out to anyone. And I feel like the last 20 years have been kind of harmful in that regard. Like many jurisdictions allowing people to pass through have also ended up wrecking, what's going on in the ground there in terms of distorting the culture and the context of that community. And so I think it's part of that global narrative of moving away from universal globalization towards more contextual integration that is an ask of jurisdictions. So in that sense, my standards are slightly different, whereas a lot of Kiwi entrepreneurs I've spoken to expect, Singapore like frictionlessness and yeah, that's not been what I've been looking for, and so in that sense, really value working here.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful example of New Zealand's opportunity to find its unique expression in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, in the innovation space, rather than just trying to be a mini version of the traditional capital markets and what's happening in other jurisdictions. It's like there's something really special here. It's still finding its way, but I think, the opportunity to build and grow something that has more of this relationship economy, more values-led, more communal, more democratic, more locally owned and governed. And I think that the blockchain space, certainly what we saw through the Edmund Hillary Fellowship journey that wasn't clear at the outset was just this resonance of people who were building in that field, being drawn into New Zealand, the Global Impact Visa Program, and EHF. And folks from Holochain, folks from Ethereum Foundation, folks from Coinbase. I mean, it's been up and down the court of, different aspects of crypto. And certainly also the prominence of the environmental space, people doing work around conservation, agriculture, different environmental objectives. So, it's good to have you in the country.
Yeah. Thank you. I feel very welcomed. And I hope to, really understand the context more and imbibe some of the cultural norms that I see here. It's been very healing for me in many ways. It's been beautiful.
How do people go deeper on Neighbourhoods, get involved, read more about it?
This year, 2024 for us is critical in working with pilot projects, people who want to build with us. While things have stabilized with the framework, we're not at the point where we can, release this in an app store and, have millions of people download it. That's part of distributed tech. And so we're building out key feature sets with these communities. Like, what should our identity stack look like? Should it be mobile first or web browser first, or should there be a well-packaged launcher? These are questions we're answering over the next few months. And so if you're interested in some of these conversations and thinking about building and formalizing your community or starting a community of your own, please reach out. We're actively speaking with projects to build out these features. Once we go through this process with Catalyst in New Zealand, you can reach out and participate and back us and fund us wherever you might be in the world. And as always, if you're keen to bring this conversation to your part of the world, we've spent so much time in people's living rooms and co-working spaces talking about it, because it's not we see it's not just, one-dimensional marketing that's going to get us there. It's a much broader activation of new patterns. And so over the next 6 months, we're also thinking of cultural hackathons, because communities are going to have to think about articulating their culture. It's almost like a lost art. It's almost like we've gotten so used to fast food, we've forgotten how to cook. And so we also see that as part of the foundation's responsibility to be out there hosting cultural hackathons. And so a few people have reached out as like potential designers of these hackathons. And if you're one of those, if that interests you, that's always something to talk about. I feel like designing cultural templates that can just be replicated and tweaked across communities is an interesting aspect of this new economic system. It's almost like the sharing of recipes. It's not, you're not losing much by sharing recipes, and so that's part of what Neighbourhoods is going to activate.
Nice. Any final messages you'd like to share, Sid?
More of gratitude for you for hosting spaces like this, for New Zealand for welcoming projects like ours, for the Edmund Hillary Fellowship for creating networks, for people who supported us along the way. It's not easy, but I guess there is there's a certain learning that we're going through as a project, because it's such a slow and hard way, and I feel like we're getting better for it. Overwhelming gratitude right now. Yeah.
Thank you to you. Thank you to Emily Rogers for connecting us.
Yeah.
And may the journey continue.
Yeah. And for you.
Let us know what you thought of that conversation with Sid by leaving us a comment below. You can explore Neighbourhoods by going to neighbourhoods.network. Of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, as it helps us with those centralized corporate Black Mirror pesky algorithms that we're all still beholden to, as we aim to elevate voices in the regenerative economy. You can find our body of work at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.